Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. As you may have guessed from the title or thumbnail of this video, I am going to be testing out my glass dip pen that I bought when I went to Korea back in October of last year. It's been a while, but I'm finally getting around to it. And before I get into the first impression / review of them, we must of course talk about the illustration first. So I went into this whole illustration process knowing that I was going to review the glass dip pen, so I decided to use hot press watercolor paper since the surface will be really smooth, and from my understanding, glass dip pens are typically meant for calligraphy purposes, and when you're doing calligraphy, you want to use really smooth paper, and so I decided that hot press paper was going to be the best way to approach this. So before we actually use the dip pen, I wanted to use watercolor washes on top first to just start mapping out the illustration. And knowing that this was going to be a glass dip pen review, I really wanted that to be the highlight. And so when I was constructing this illustration, I purposely kept in mind of having a lot of detail so that we could really highlight the line art. And in that vein, I wanted to keep the actual colors fairly not flat, but I didn't want to really focus too much on rendering in the sense of like really intense shading. I wanted to keep that to a minimum and just go with gradients and just a little bit of rendering to give the characters a little bit of life and dimension. But I really enjoy this approach because it allows me to just let the watercolors do their thing with, you know, the soft gradients, and also I don't have to use as much brain power of like, where's the light source and does this shadow make sense? Is this realistic? Yada yada yada. I really am enjoying just coloring, painting for the purpose of a beautiful vignette illustration, I guess, if that makes sense. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. As you might know, Squarespace is a great platform that is so versatile for many different applications as a creative. One of those things is having an online store. Here I have a secret shop that allows all of my patrons to access the previous Patreon print and sticker rewards, so you can get all of the Zodiac ones that you missed out on. And a great feature is that you can actually connect your Square Reader to your shop so that you can keep track of your inventory if you do in-person events as well, which makes everything so streamlined. So if you're interested in checking out Squarespace, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. If you've been with me for a while, you might recognize these character designs. They are my kind of angel and devil characters that I've drawn a number of times over the years. I've named them Sugar and Spice. And this month of August officially marks my 5-year anniversary of being a full-time artist and having quit my day job at the time back in 2020. And I largely have my Patreon community to thank for that. So as a extra thank you to them, I wanted to make this month's print mail reward a little bit more special. And so this artwork will have additional silver foil accents on the prints that I send out. And I am really looking forward to that because it's not something I've ever done with the actual prints before. I often use metallics in my illustrations, but it's never able to be translated into the print. I do often have like holographic metallic glitter accents on the stickers, but this will be the first time I'm actually adding it to the prints. So that's my extra little thank you gift to them. And if you are interested, if you sign up anytime this month before August 31st, you will be able to receive these gals in the mail. And I do believe it's probably the most affordable way to receive artwork from me because the shipping, international shipping included, is built into the price that you pay on Patreon. Plus, you also get access to exclusive videos, huge catalog that I have on there from the past 5 years, as well as wallpapers and extra digital goodies that I don't necessarily post anywhere else. Oddly, this was like one of my favorite parts of the painting process, was alternating between this ultramarine violet and this, I forget the shade name, but this kind of purple leaning blue. I have been really trying to embrace being a little bolder when it comes to my watercolor saturation, like right off the bat, especially in areas where I know that it's going to be dark anyways, as opposed to doing several, thin layers. I've been just trying to be more decisive about, okay, this area I know I want it to be really vibrant and kind of deeper, so why not just go ahead and do it right away? And I have been really enjoying just, alternating between 2 or more colors while it's still wet, so you get that really seamless kind of blended effect. And I really love how it looks on the leaf here with the dark blue at the root and then it fading into the purple on the tip there. And basically I just make sure to have both colors already pre-mixed on the palette on the side, and then that way I can just alternate between the 2 of them. And this is a really great way of adding interest to the area without necessarily having to do any quote-unquote shading, because you're just painting with 2 different colors, but it still creates like a sense of interest without it just being flat in with one wash of color. You can see I did that with the big red ribbon as well. I had alternated between a red and a magenta just to just give it some interest, but not really worrying about shading necessarily. Another part that I really like is the devil character's hair. So I knew that I wanted her hair to be really dark, but I also wanted to have the highlights kind of peek through as well. So I ended up going with that light pink as a base first. And then when it came to painting the angel character, I decided to take a leap of faith and paint completely over the eyes. This is something that I don't normally do. I typically paint around the eyes when I'm painting a character, especially when it comes to a darker tone. But I've been noticing that there is something much more kind of lived in looking when you have the whites of the eyes not technically white. But going back to the devil character's hair, we can see here that I'm now painting in the actual shade of her hair. And similar to the wing, I'm alternating between the purple and that blue, and then leaving the highlight of the hair open for where that light pink wash has been put down. And I really, really love the effect that this gives. It just feels so much more harmonious with the rest of the illustration as opposed to having just a stark white highlight on the hair. And you can kind of see that I incorporate that magenta pretty much throughout the entire illustration. So everything feels really, really cohesive. And again, really leaning into the gradients with the watercolors. So having the top of her head, like the roots of her hair, be that super, super dark blue, like concentrated, and then fading it out into the purple, but then also using a clean, wet paintbrush to buff out the edges so that it blends into the pink highlight. And then adding in that little touch of blue to really deepen those areas while the paint is still wet. And you can see that it actually naturally just bleeding into the area that has been painted already. It's just, that's like the magic of painting with watercolors. It's just watching the paints do its thing. And it's something I really want to embrace more and more of, because I tend to have a bit of a controlling streak when it comes to watercolors. And I know I'm still, my illustration style, I'll never fully break away from that. It's very clean, but I am trying to let the watercolors breathe a little bit here and there so that it's, I'm taking advantage of the medium. I have said this before about hot press paper, that it is harder to achieve gradients and like even washes with it as opposed to cold press watercolor paper. But one thing that I found really helpful, especially when it came to the alternating color gradient that I've been doing, is I have been using 2 paintbrushes at the same time. So you can see here that I'm using one paintbrush for the red, and then you can see in the bottom left-hand corner there, I have the second paintbrush ready to go, and then use the magenta color in tandem with the other paintbrush. And I find that this method of going back and forth with the 2 different paintbrushes, not only is it faster, and it also allows me to keep each color really vibrant and quote unquote like pure. And now for the moment we've all been waiting for, the glass dip pen. So like I mentioned earlier, I bought this when I was in Korea. I got it at this really, really beautiful stationery store in Hongdae. And I have been wanting to try glass dip pens for a number of years, but I just never got around to purchasing one until I saw it in the stationery store. So I'm going to be using this. I believe it's an acrylic ink. I got it in the Haikala art box many, many years ago. This glass dip pen does not fit inside the bottle there, so I'm just using the dropper and putting it directly onto the dip pen here. Thankfully, I had the foresight to do this over a scrap piece of paper because I really didn't know what I was doing here, but wanted to load it up there. And as soon as I tip it over, you can see that it started to pool, like a huge glob of paint was pooling. So I realized that I had put way too much ink on there. So I ended up just, letting a lot of it drip down there, and then start actually drawing on the illustration. And right off the bat, I noticed that it was still too much ink. I think it was sort of bleeding a little bit and feathering, and it was initially a little bit wobbly, probably me just getting used to it, but also I was noticing that I think you kind of have to wear down the tip just slightly, I suppose, or maybe, because I'm holding it at like a slight angle. I don't know. It took a little moment. At first, I was like, ooh, maybe I'm not going to like this. I realized that even though hot press paper is smooth, when using a glass dip pen, it's still, you can kind of feel there's a little bit of texture. Like there's still grains that it sort of catches on, which is creating this like, slightly wobbly effect. But I pretty quickly kind of got the hang of it. Over the course of the illustration, I would still encounter, wobbly lines. But yeah, I do really like using it. And much like any new medium, it does take a little bit of getting used to and practice. But now you can see that, yeah, just kind of dipping it into the glob of paint there was sufficient. I'm glad that I didn't have to dip it directly into the ink bottle, because I was worried that if I had to dip it into an ink bottle, that the ink bottle eventually would run, or it would start to dry out. So I'm glad that I can just, deposit some paint or ink on the side and use it that way. But yeah, you can see working on the second rows here, the lines are a lot better, like cleaner. You can see though, when you start to run out of ink on there, it does start to thin out. And then when you dip it into fresh ink, the lines are a little bit thicker and juicier. So there is some line variation that you get here, but I do think that it is a little bit more consistent than it would be if I'm using a paintbrush, because a paintbrush obviously is very reliant on the amount of pressure that you're putting onto the bristles. So I did end up attempting to use the dip pen with this silver acrylic ink that I put down here, but I noticed that it just doesn't pick up, the dip pen doesn't pick up the ink because I think this particular one that I have is a little bit too thick. So that's something to keep in mind when you're picking your inks for a glass dip pen, is it has to be very, very fluid. Otherwise, it just doesn't, it just sort of like sits there. And yeah, basically my hope for the Patreon print is that all of the parts that I painted metallic silver here in the original illustration, I will be able to foil onto the print. Although I'm realizing that some of these details, like the jewelry, is gonna read so tiny in a 4x6 inch postcard, so I'm not sure if they will be able to get that detailed with it, but we'll see. And then I do switch over to some acrylic gouache just for the black background here, because in my opinion, it's just the most satisfying matte even black that I can get. I have tried to do this with acrylic ink before, but I find that when you're trying to get it to be super even and flat, the acrylic ink is just not going to be quite as good for that. And also, I find that when you're using acrylic inks in a really, really concentrated form, it can kind of dry a little bit shiny, which I love for, you know, the metallic accents, but I don't want that for the solid black background. So acrylic ink is my favorite choice. Technically, I could use a regular gouache as well. Oh, did I say acrylic ink? I meant acrylic gouache. I technically could use a regular gouache as well, but the nice thing about using the acrylic gouache is that it's not going to smudge later on when I continue to work on this illustration, and that's something you definitely don't want, especially when it comes to black. Because if I use regular gouache and continue to work on the watercolor bits and, you know, things like that, it definitely would have smudged all over the place. But yeah, now I'm going back in with more watercolors. Just after you add in that darkest dark, it really kind of washes a lot of things out. So I went in and, you know, just pumped up the saturation, especially when it comes to adding, you know, the blush on faces. This is something that I think really helps give the faces dimension without really having to do much shading. Honestly, it's literally just like flat wash of the base color, some blush, and then I do like the tiniest hint of shadow under the nose and the mouth basically, but that's kind of it. And then in line with trying to get all the colors to feel really harmonious with each other, I decided to put in some of that blue as an additional shade to the angel character's hair. I really wanted to keep her hair as pastel as possible, but it was just feeling a little bit too flat in comparison to the devil character's hair, since there was so many more shades of colors happening there, like more hues, I should say. So I did go in with really, really light washes of the blue in the angel character's hair, and I do like how that turned out. But I did want her to, you know, stand out from the background there. So you can see I'm adding in another darker layer of blue right around her head, just so that she pops a little bit. You're trying to get in, you know, that contrast there. And if you've seen these characters before, you might know or remember that originally the angel character actually had like kind of a darker brown hair. And I decided to change it to this, you know, light lilac, because I just love opposites and I love contrast. So I found that having the devil character be super pale skinned with dark hair, it kind of, you know, the symmetry, the yin and yang made sense to have the angel character have a deeper skin tone and then, you know, really light hair. Plus now they both have purple hued hair colors, one just being a really dark value and then one being a really light value. And it just makes for more colorful illustrations as opposed to having her hair and skin tone be kind of similar to each other. But anyways, going back to the glass dip pen again, I'm now using a magenta ink to do more line art, and here you can see the glass dip pen, the way that it just sort of like almost sucks up the ink into the little grooves. It's like magic. It is so cool. And I will say that the glass dip pen is quite easy to clean. Basically, I just, rinse it and like kind of dunk it in water immediately after I finish using it. And then I just take a paper towel and like the groove of my nail and just sort of like scrape the residue of the ink off of the dip pen, if that makes sense. I thought I had filmed this, but I guess I didn't, unfortunately. But in any case, yeah, unfortunately it doesn't just like slide off. Like you kind of have to scrape it off a little bit from in like the grooves, but it's like very easy to do, so long as you don't let the acrylic ink completely like dry on the dip pen, if that makes sense. For those of you who don't know, I have talked about this before, that I hold on to like my paintbrushes, my pencils, whatever tool that I'm using really, really tightly, because I want to be able to have as much control and precision as possible. And that does result in a lot of fatigue and strain in my arm and hand muscles, especially when it comes to doing line art and like fine details with a paintbrush, because like I mentioned earlier, you are really having to control the pressure when it comes to the width that you're trying to achieve with a paintbrush because of the flexibility of the bristles. But I find that with a glass pen, it is, while yes, like I am getting slight variances in the width of the line art, the variances is much more slight. And so I feel like that is actually a lot better for getting around not having to strain my muscles nearly as much, which is definitely what I was hoping for. I had tried like a typical dip pen with like the metal nibs a long time ago, but I found that those were more difficult to use than this glass dip pen, and the glass dip pen is a lot easier to clean in my opinion as well. So I'm really happy about this. The only downside is, I am sort of stuck with just like the one thickness as opposed to those metal nibs. You can buy multiple different thicknesses. You can see here that the line art is reading fairly thick when it comes to these laces on the arm there, but I'm not entirely mad at it, honestly. I think that something that I've noticed is when I compare my finished illustrations to my sketches, there's a lot of times where I prefer the sketch, and sometimes I'm like trying to figure out why. And I do think part of it is that the sketch is often a lot thicker. Like the line art itself, it's a lot thicker and messier. And so having this glass dip pen be a little bit thicker just by default, it's actually probably a good thing for me in the long run. But I will say another con with the glass dip pen is that the handle is a little bit awkward to hold, and it is very skinny. If you saw it at the beginning, like the base has sort of like a bulbous sort of shape, and then it tapers out into a very skinny handle. And yeah, I find it's just weird to hold in my hand, but maybe I'm not holding it correctly, or I just need to kind of get used to it. But that is something that I did take note of and didn't necessarily love. But again, I think that all of the pros that I've mentioned so far will outweigh the cons, and I do look forward to continuing to use this. And yeah, I'm happy to finally get use out of these Hikala inks. I mean, they're not Hikala inks, but I got them from the Hikala art box because I haven't touched these inks in literal years. So I'm very glad that they were still good. And I'm really pleased that the dip pen will be able to just like sort of pick up the ink just from it being, blobbed onto a palette, as opposed to having to dip the entire nib into an inkwell. Because like I mentioned before, I really don't want to have an inkwell just open for 30 minutes or whatever at a time, because then the ink will definitely dry out a lot quicker, which is not what you want. And additionally, because I am able to deposit the ink onto a palette, I could also mix the colors as well and create custom colors from multiple different inks, which is a huge benefit, especially if you want to create different shades and hues, as opposed to having to dip the glass dip pen directly into the well. That way you would only be limited to the pure version of that color. And I just know that if I had an open bottle of ink just sitting next to me while I'm working, I for sure would knock that over, and that would just be a tragedy. I've seen other people do it, so I'm very glad that the glass dip pen is not required to be able to be used that way. But I was still a little nervous about, my proficiency with the tool. So for the really important facial features here, I did go ahead and use my 3/0 paintbrush, because while I do like the glass dip pen, the paintbrush is unmatched in being able to get those really fine details, and also just the nuances of the tapered brush stroke for the lashes is something that I really wanted to still have. Plus, I'm still just more comfortable using a paintbrush, and the facial features are definitely the most important part of this illustration. But yeah, in conclusion, I do really love the glass dip pen. I hope that my review / first impressions was helpful to you if you have been curious about them yourself. I know that they come in a lot of varying price points, and I do believe they are fairly common at stationery stores. I would say go to a stationery store over a art supply store if you're curious about getting one, because I think that's its initial purpose. And it does make me curious about trying calligraphy ink to use with it as opposed to an acrylic ink, because there are some really beautiful calligraphy inks out there that sort of like are almost multicolor, where I'm assuming that it just has like multiple different color pigments in it, and the way that it's suspended in the ink, it just sort of like changes as you use it, or like shines differently in the light. I'm kind of imagining it to be akin to a granulating watercolor, but in ink form. So I think that would be really cool. If you are a calligraphy ink person, please recommend your favorites in the comments section, and maybe I will be able to check it out. Specifically, I am looking for ones that are almost like color changing or multicolor, because otherwise I have plenty of acrylic inks that could serve the purpose of just being like a solid color. But let me know if you have any ink recommendations, and I'll be happy to take a look-see, since thankfully Toronto, we have quite a number of stationery stores that I can check out. And before you go, as a friendly reminder, this artwork is the monthly print reward for my Patreon this month, and it will have the silver foiling. And if you are also interested, the sticker design is of these two characters as cute little cherries, definitely inspired by the Pop Mart Crybaby series. I've just been obsessed with this particular keychain. Don't have it myself. I've been kind of trying to resist, but this close. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and yeah, give me your calligraphy ink recommendations down below. And if you like this illustration, should I make this like a large print in my regular shop as well? Anyways, I hope you have an amazing day or evening wherever you're at, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.